Welcome back to another explainer. Today we're looking at something genuinely unique. We're going to take a tiny 25-verse ancient text and treat it not just as a piece of religious history, but as a fascinating, intense masterclass in crisis management. I mean, the Book of Jude is incredibly short, yes, but it packs an absolute wallop. This is not some gentle letter of encouragement. This is literally an alarm bell ringing in the middle of the night.
So let's just dive right into this dramatic cold open. Imagine sitting down to write a joyful, celebratory letter to your friends, only to get news so bad that you literally have to scrap the entire draft and start completely over. Well, that's exactly what happens right here. Jude drops us straight into the middle of a sudden pivot, from a warm, friendly message to a severe, urgent warning. He goes from wanting to talk about their shared salvation to urging his audience to actively contend for the faith.
The crucial takeaway here is this sudden, forced pivot. His original plan, a peaceful discussion about shared beliefs, but his new reality became an absolute call to arms. And why the pivot? Because as the text tells us, godless men had secretly slipped into the community. And these infiltrators, they weren't just disagreeing on minor theological points, they were fundamentally twisting the core message. They were actually turning the concept of grace into a literal license for immorality. Jude knew he had to act fast.
Which brings us to part 1, Echoes of Ancient Judgments.
To make sure his audience grasps the sheer gravity of this infiltration, Jude immediately turns to history. He brilliantly constructs this severe legal argument, rapid-firing well-known historical precedents to prove a point. Rebellion has consequences, no matter who you are. He starts with the people delivered out of Egypt who later fell into disbelief and were destroyed. Then he scales it way up to the cosmic level, angels who abandon their positions of authority and are now bound in darkness. Finally, he brings up the infamous destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He's basically telling them, look at the pattern. No one is exempt from the consequences of turning away. It sets a terrifying precedent for the fate awaiting the current threat.
Let's move on to section 2, Vivid Metaphors and Ancient Prophecies.
Now, Jude shifts from historical arguments to some of the most poetic and visually striking imagery in all of ancient literature. He perfectly aligns natural elements with absolute failure. He describes these infiltrators as clouds without rain, promising life but delivering absolutely nothing, just blown around by the wind. They're autumn trees without fruit, useless, uprooted, and entirely dead. He calls them wild waves of the sea, creating chaos and just foaming up their own shame. And finally, wandering stars, celestial bodies that have completely lost their orbit, destined for the blackest darkness. It is an incredibly powerful way to say these men are an absolute blemish on the community. They look the part, for sure, but they completely fail to deliver on their fundamental purpose.
But Jude doesn't stop with nature metaphors. He then fires off a triad of references to infamous ancient figures, starting by condemning the infiltrators for taking the way of Cain. This represents a path of violent jealousy, someone who completely rejects righteous instruction and chooses a destructive, incredibly selfish path instead.
Next, he links them to Balaam's error. Now, this is a fascinating historical reference to a figure who was actually willing to curse a nation for a paycheck, essentially acting as an ancient prophet for hire. By using this, Jude paints a picture of people who eagerly trade their integrity for personal advantage. They're rushing headlong into moral compromise purely for profit. It's a really piercing critique of their underlying self-serving motives. And to cap off this trio of doom, he brings up Korah's rebellion. In the ancient texts, Korah led a direct, arrogant uprising against established leadership, which, as you might guess, ended in utter disaster. By categorizing the infiltrators this way, Jude is identifying them as fundamentally arrogant, anti-authority figures who are doomed to the exact same destruction. To really drive home exactly how wildly arrogant these infiltrators are, Jude provides a mind-bending contrast. On one hand, you have the infiltrators, right? Slandering celestial beings and speaking abusively about spiritual matters they don't even understand. But on the other hand, you have the archangel Michael. According to the tradition Jude cites here, when Michael was disputing with the devil himself over the body of Moses, even this immensely powerful archangel showed restraint. He didn't bring a slanderous accusation, he simply said, "The Lord rebuke you." Jude's point is piercing. If an archangel exercises that kind of restraint with the devil, who did these infiltrators think they are, mouthing off about things they don't even comprehend?
He even pulls out a prophecy from Enoch, noted as the seventh from Adam, just to prove that this isn't some new problem catching the universe by surprise. These grumblers, fault-finders, and flatterers were actually prophesied to face judgment long ago. The text notes that the Lord is coming with thousands of holy ones to execute justice against all ungodly acts. The crisis is severe, yes, but from Jude's perspective, it is entirely under divine jurisdiction. Which brings us to our third section, the strategy for defense. So, after firmly establishing the severity of the crisis, identifying the infiltrators, and reminding his audience that the apostles actually warned them that scoffers would come, Jude lays out a tactical solution, and he starts with a step-by-step internal defense strategy. Think about it. When a community is under attack from within, the first step is always fortification. Step 1, build yourselves up in your most holy faith. Basically, strengthen your foundation. Step 2, pray. Stay connected to the source. Step 3, keep yourselves in God's love as you wait for the mercy that brings eternal life. This is the inner work required to survive a crisis of division and corrupted truth. But internal defense isn't enough, right? He also gives these really nuanced external directives on how to handle the casualties, with varying degrees of emergency response. First, be merciful to those who doubt. Some people are just confused by the false teaching, so treat them with compassion. Second, for those further gone, you have to take drastic action. Snatch others from the fire and save them. It is a literal emergency rescue operation. And third, for those deeply entrenched in the corruption, show mercy but mixed with fear. You have to hate even the clothing stained by the corruption. It's a striking way of saying help them, but be incredibly careful you don't get infected by the very toxicity you're trying to pull them out of. Finally, Section 4, a doxology for the ages. Jude closes this urgent, intense warning with a doxology that stands out for its majestic literary power. I mean, after spending 23 verses mourning about stumbling, failing, and falling into corruption, Jude just completely shifts gears. He points them to the one who is able to keep you from falling. This massive shift in tone leaves the original audience, and honestly us too, with a profound sense of hope and absolute authority. The crisis is real, the threat is dangerous, for sure, but the ultimate power, majesty, and authority rest far above the chaos of the infiltrators. As we wrap up this explainer, consider this final thought. We've just analyzed an ancient text dealing with a very specific historical crisis. But think about how the patterns we saw, the twisting of truth for personal gain, the arrogance that rejects authority, the grumbling that divides communities, and the desperate need for a unified, merciful defense strategy, they remain just as incredibly relevant right now as they were 2 millennia ago. What ancient warnings are we perhaps ignoring in our own modern structures today? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.